Okay, so
Yeah.
get this. We're diving into some comments from former President Trump. And he suggested that the U.S. should just annex Canada and Mexico, make them states.
Yeah.
Kind of wild,
That
right?
certainly raises eyebrows,
Yeah.
to say the least.
You're probably thinking, hold on, is this real? Oh, it's real. All right, Trump said this on the campaign trail recently, and our sources are buzzing about it. We've got a piece from Econo Times and, of course, the ever-lively discussions over on Reddit. And don't worry, we're not taking sides here. We're just here to unpack the reactions, and you know what this all means, especially for you, our listener up north.
That's right.
Focusing on the implications.
Exactly.
So according to Econo Times, Trump is taking aim at the USMCA, the trade deal between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. He's essentially claiming that the U.S. is getting a raw deal, that it's footing too much of the bill without reaping equal benefits.
And it's worth noting that this kind of rhetoric isn't really new for Trump. Remember his stance on NAFTA. It's this America as the victim in trade deals. It's a recurring theme for him. It seems to resonate with a certain segment of the population who feel left behind by globalization. Those who see these trade deals as benefiting everyone else at their expense.
That's a great point. And speaking of things resonating, our Redditors flagged something pretty fascinating. There's this growing belief among some Americans that the U.S. government is literally sending money to Canada, like cutting checks.
Ah, yes, the ever-persistent myth of the trade deficit.
Which, of course, is not how trade deficits work
Well,
at all.
Yeah.
But it really shows how these misconceptions can take root and really shape public opinion.
Absolutely. For our listener, it's important to understand that a trade deficit simply means that the U.S. is buying more goods and services from Canada than it's selling to them. It's not a direct payment or a subsidy from one government to another.
Right. And one of our Redditors put hilariously, I have a trade deficit with my barber. He cuts my hair every month, but he doesn't buy a single thing from me.
I love that analogy. It perfectly captures the concept. You're paying for a service, not funding your barber's entire business.
Right.
And with global trade, things are even more complex. It's not just about the flow of goods between two countries. We're in a globalized economy where parts and components cross borders multiple times before a finished product is even made.
This myth-busting is so important because it gets to the heart of why some people might find Trump's proposal appealing. That idea that someone is winning and someone is losing in these trade deals.
Exactly. It plays into that sense of victimhood we were talking about.
Now, predictably, there was immediate international backlash to Trump's statement. Econo Times reported strong condemnation from both Prime Minister Trudeau and the Mexican president.
Well, that's not surprising at all. This kind of rhetoric can be very damaging to diplomatic relations. It erodes trust between nations, leaving everyone wondering where they stand.
It's like walking into a room and just throwing a grenade in the middle of it.
A very apt analogy.
But the reactions from Redditors were much more, shall we say, diverse. Some echoed Trump's sentiments, while others were deeply concerned about what this could mean for Canada's sovereignty, especially its cherished healthcare system.
There's a quote from a Canadian Redditor that I think perfectly sums up this sentiment. I'd rather have to wait a bit for healthcare and it still be free than get bankrupted by a single trip to the ER. That really crystallizes the difference in values between the two countries, something that would make any kind of integration incredibly challenging.
It really does. And that difference in values goes beyond healthcare. It's deeply ingrained in Canadian identity and how Canadians view their social systems.
Absolutely. And even without annexation, these differences can lead to tensions. Think about the ongoing debates around healthcare costs, drug pricing, and the role of social safety nets. These issues are likely to be key sticking points in future trade negotiations.
That's an excellent point. We could spend hours unpacking just that. But for now, let's get back to the economic side of things. Trump has been critical of trade deficits for a long time, but let's be clear for our listeners, a trade deficit is just a snapshot in time. It doesn't tell the whole story.
You're right, trade deficits aren't about direct payments, but they can signal underlying economic imbalances. In this case, it's worth exploring why the U.S. buys more from Canada than vice versa. What specific goods are involved, and how does this impact various industries and jobs on both sides of the border?
That's a great question, and it's one that deserves a deep dive of its own. It's all about understanding the nuances, the interconnectedness of our economies.
Precisely. And when we look at the bigger picture, this annexation comment fits into a pattern with Trump's America First approach. There's a tendency towards aggressive rhetoric and actions that often alienate allies.
Some of our Redditors were quick to point that out. One comment I saw said, this kind of talk weakens the West and actually benefits Russia by driving a wedge between allies.
Now, whether you agree with that assessment or not, it does raise an interesting question. Could this America First approach backfire and ultimately undermine U.S. interests? It's something to ponder.
Definitely something for our listeners to think about. So we've got this seemingly outlandish annexation proposal, and while the likelihood of it actually happening is, let's face it, pretty slim.
Slim to none, really.
Right. But it does expose those underlying tensions, those differences in values and priorities that exist between the U.S. and Canada.
And these tensions exist regardless of any talk of annexation. We see them play out in trade disputes and different approaches to climate change, even in those subtle cultural perceptions and stereotypes.
This whole idea, wild as it might seem, is like a mirror reflecting back some very real anxieties and uncertainties within the U.S. and its relationship with the world.
That's a great way to put it. It forces us to ask, okay, what's really going on here? And that's what these deep dives are all about, aren't they? We take something seemingly absurd and use it as a springboard to examine these bigger questions about identity power and the future of international relations.
Exactly. And speaking of identity, what about Canada's role in all of this? If the U.S. continues down this America First path, where does that leave Canada on the world stage?
That's the question that lingers, isn't it?
We'll continue to explore that in just a moment.
Yeah.
Right after a quick break.
So we've talked about the reactions in the broader context, but let's shift gears for a moment, just for fun. Let's entertain this what-if scenario.
Okay, I'm game. Let's say, hypothetically, this annexation actually happened. How would these two very different countries even begin to merge? What would that even look like on the ground?
Well, it would be an absolutely monumental undertaking, to say the least. Think about it. You'd have to harmonize vastly different legal systems, not to mention healthcare models, social safety nets, approaches to gun control. The list goes on and on.
And our Redditors were definitely grappling with those practicalities.
Yeah.
A lot of the comments focused on concerns about Canada's social programs, especially the universal healthcare system.
Rightfully so. Canada has a strong social safety net, and for many Canadians, that's a core part of their national identity. Integrating that with the U.S. system, which is much more individualistic and market-driven, would be incredibly challenging, both politically and logistically.
One commenter put it this way: imagine trying to explain to Americans why they should pay for healthcare for 38 million Canadians. It really highlights that cultural disconnect we were talking about earlier.
Absolutely. And it's not just healthcare. Canada has stricter gun control laws, different environmental regulations, and a completely different approach to things like drug policy. Trying to reconcile those differences wouldn't be a walk in the park. It would be more like navigating a political and logistical minefield.
It's fascinating to imagine how these two distinct cultures would clash or perhaps find ways to blend.
And that's what makes this deep dive so thought-provoking. It forces us to examine not just the political and economic implications, but the cultural ones as well. How would Canadian identity evolve within the context of the U.S.? Would those values and traditions be preserved, or would they be transformed?
Okay, but let's not forget about the practical side of things. We're talking about merging two massive and complex economies. What would happen to the Canadian dollar? How would businesses adapt?
Well, there would definitely be winners and losers. Some industries might thrive with increased access to the U.S. market, while others could struggle to compete. And the real estate market, oh boy, that would likely see some major shifts.
Our Reddit thread was buzzing with speculation about that. Some users were joking about Americans fleeing north for affordable housing, while others were worried about Canadian cities being overrun by U.S. investors.
And those concerns aren't unfounded. We've seen how gentrification can impact communities, and an influx of American capital could have a profound effect on the Canadian landscape, both literally and figuratively.
It's like a giant game of what if, but with real-world consequences. But let's be real here. The odds of this annexation actually happening are
astronomically low. It's important to keep that in mind. But even as a hypothetical scenario, it shines a light on the fault lines, those points of tension and differences that exist between these two countries.
And those tensions exist even without the annexation talk. We see it in trade disputes, in different approaches to climate change, even in those subtle cultural perceptions and stereotypes.
You know, this whole idea, outlandish as it might seem, serves as a kind of Rorschach test. It reveals these deeper anxieties and uncertainties within the U.S. and its relationship with the world. It's a way of projecting those anxieties outward.
So it's not really about Canada at all.
Well, not entirely. It's about the U.S. trying to grapple with its place in a changing world order.
That makes sense. But where does Canada fit into that? Would it be a willing participant in this new world order, a reluctant partner?
Yeah.
Or something else entirely?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If the U.S. continues down a path of isolationism and strained alliances, what choices does Canada have to make? How does it protect its interests and its identity on the world stage?
It's a delicate balancing act, for sure. Canada has deep economic and cultural ties to the U.S., but there's also a strong desire to maintain its sovereignty and forge its own path.
And as we move further into the 21st century with all its complexities and challenges, that balancing act is only going to become more difficult and more crucial.
So as we wrap up our deep dives into this annexation bombshell,
Hmm.
what are the key takeaways for our listeners? What do we want them to walk away with?
Well, on the surface, it's a reminder of the power of rhetoric. How a single statement, even one that seems completely out there, can spark intense debate and reveal those simmering tensions that exist just below the surface.
It also shows how easily misinformation can spread and how it can shape public perception, even when it's completely detached from reality.
But on a deeper level, this deep dive challenges us to think critically about the relationships between nations, about the forces that shape global politics and the values that define us as individuals and as societies.
And as we've seen in this discussion, those values can be surprisingly diverse, even among countries that share a continent and a long history of cooperation.
Absolutely. And that diversity, those differences in perspectives and priorities are something to be acknowledged, understood, and even celebrated.
Because it's through those differences that we learn, we grow, and we find ways to build a more just and equitable world, even if it means occasionally having to wade through some pretty wild what-if scenarios along the way.
It's a reminder that the world is complex, interconnected, and constantly evolving. And as individuals, we have a responsibility to stay informed, to engage in meaningful dialogue, and to challenge our own assumptions.
And maybe, just maybe by doing so, we can help shape a future where annexation remains firmly in the realm of hypothetical deep dives.
A future where we focus on building bridges, not walls.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up entirely, there's one more crucial point we need to address. This whole conversation has really underlined how important critical thinking is, especially now when information and misinformation spread so quickly.
Yeah, it's true. We're bombarded with so much these days. It can be incredibly difficult to filter out the noise and really figure out what's actually reliable and what's worth paying attention to.
It's like trying to drink from a fire hose.
Exactly. And that's why it's more crucial than ever to question assumptions, to seek out diverse perspectives, and to be wary of those easy answers and quick fixes that often dominate the headlines.
Like the idea that annexing entire countries could be like a solution to complex trade issues, that definitely falls into the too good to be true category, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's a very simplistic solution to a very complex problem, and it completely ignores the human element, the cultural and social realities that shape these international relationships.
It also raises questions about power dynamics and the potential for exploitation. Like, if one country is significantly larger and more powerful than its neighbors, does that automatically give it the right to dictate the terms of engagement?
That's a dangerous path to go down, and it's something that we as informed citizens need to be aware of and actively resist.
Because at the end of the day, international relations shouldn't be about domination or coercion. They should be about building mutually beneficial partnerships based on respect, understanding, and a genuine willingness to cooperate.
And those partnerships require ongoing dialogue, a willingness to truly listen to different perspectives, and a commitment to finding common ground even when it's difficult.
And sometimes finding that common ground might mean accepting that there are just some things that can't be perfectly equalized or balanced.
Like the size of economies or the differences in cultural values and priorities.
Exactly. It's about recognizing and respecting those differences and working within those parameters to find solutions that benefit all parties involved.
It's about acknowledging that a win-win scenario is possible, even if it doesn't always look the way we initially expect it to.
That's a powerful message.
Good.
And it's one that we need to carry with us, not just in our discussions about international relations, but in all aspects of our lives.
I couldn't agree more. Whether we're talking about trade deals, environmental policies, or any other issue that crosses borders, it's crucial to approach these conversations with a spirit of collaboration and a recognition of our shared humanity.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this thought-provoking topic, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
I think the key takeaway here is the importance of engaging in these difficult conversations. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines and the rhetoric, but it's crucial to dig deeper, to challenge our assumptions, and to seek out those nuanced perspectives that often get lost in the noise.
And remember, even seemingly outlandish ideas can serve as valuable springboards for deeper reflection and understanding. By exploring those what-if scenarios, we can gain new insights into the complex realities of our world and the challenges we face together.
And who knows? Maybe by engaging in those conversations, by asking those tough questions, we can help create a future where those outlandish scenarios remain just that hypothetical thought experiments.
A future where collaboration and understanding prevail. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. A huge thank you to our expert for sharing their incredible insights.
It's been a pleasure.
And to you, our listener, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you found this exploration informative and thought-provoking. And remember, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic to unpack. Until then, stay curious.